revealing of what the United States did and did not do. Is that better?
Yeah.
Okay. Did and did not do, and Rebecca will tell us more about that. And it was really how we were able to respond to the Holocaust and what we did in this country. So I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, and then we'll have questions after. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. I have known Barbara for a long time. I think I was in Tallahassee in 2018 or 2019, not long after the book came out, and had a great time. And so I'm sorry that I'm only here virtually. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and make sure that you can see it. So somebody jump in if there's any sort of problem with the image. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of history that I tell in the book, and a little bit about how I do research and how I put together the book and how I tend to work. It's going to be different for every historian, but I think one of the reasons that people are interested in book talks is, if you just wanted a summary of the book, you could just read the back. So I'm going to talk a little bit about my process and how and why I came to this topic, and a little bit about what I do. So this, as Barbara said, is my first book, Rescue Board: The Untold Story of America's Efforts to Save the Jews of Europe. And in the book, if you get a copy or pick it up at the library, it starts the first full weekend of August 1942 in the Les Milles internment camp in southern France. And you meet Roswell McClelland, who is the man here on the right. He went by Ross to his friends. He was at this point 28 years old and was born in California. He was an aid worker with the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. And in August 1942, he is actually inside a French internment camp, providing aid on behalf of the American organization. And he is witnessing the first wave of deportations of foreign Jews north from Les Milles, which is in the southern part of France, to Drancy, which was a camp outside of Paris. And from there, those people are being, we now know, sent to Auschwitz, where most of them will be killed on arrival. And Ross knows very vaguely what is going to happen to these people. In fact, only a week earlier, he had managed to get an interview with Pierre Laval, who was the head of Nazi collaborating southern France, Vichy France. And he had specifically told Laval that the Nazis planned to exterminate these people. And that's the wording that he used in 1942 in his notes. And so he says, you have to call off these deportations. You cannot let the Nazis come down, take these people, and send them to German-occupied Poland. And Laval, the French leader, had laughed at him. And he had said, that's just a rumor, that this is not, the Germans are taking these foreign Jews to work in Poland. And besides, Laval told McClelland, if your country, if the United States cares so much about the fate of these people, why haven't you taken them? And so Rescue Board is a little bit about how we got to there. And my work is a lot bit about how we got to there. How US immigration laws had been structured since the 1920s, specifically to keep out Southern and Eastern Europeans, which are places where large Jewish communities lived. That the United States had a lot of information about the rise of Nazism, about the early persecution of German Jews, even in 1933. And Americans at that point rallied and marched and signed petitions by the millions. There were over 1 million people participating in these protests in 1933. But Americans tend to have a short attention span. And so as the news of what was happening to German Jews started to fall off the front pages of American newspapers, Americans tended to stop paying attention. In part because we were still a racist country, an anti-Semitic country, an isolationist country that did not want to get involved in world affairs. And overwhelmingly, Americans, and on a bipartisan basis, this was not just a Republican thing or just a Democrat thing, on a bipartisan basis, we're against increasing immigration. In 1938, right after the Nazis invaded, or the Nazis occupied Austria, a group of Jewish congressmen actually got together and decided amongst themselves that none of them were going to introduce any new immigration legislation, that the issue was so toxic that even though now hundreds of thousands of people are joining waiting lists to immigrate to the United States, and this was at a time when we did not have a refugee policy, so you could only come as an immigrant. Hundreds of thousands of people are crowding those lists, trying desperately to get out. The idea that you would try to change the law seemed ridiculous, that any attempt to change the law to open up immigration would only have resulted in lowering the numbers, not in raising them. And so people would have fought back and immigration would have actually decreased instead of increased. So they decide it's better to not have the debate. It's better to just try to keep things as they are. And so the refugee crisis that kicks off as the Nazis start occupying and invading more territories continues even after Pearl Harbor, even after the United States got involved in the war, because there are still Jewish communities in Casablanca, for example, in Lisbon, in Marseille, in southern France, who are still trying to get out. And so this becomes a story of how there's an American witnessing deportations from the inside of a camp. But mainly the story is about what happens next. Because Roswell McClelland in Les Milles is not the only person working that first full weekend of August 1942. Gerhard Rigner, who was the head of the organization called the World Jewish Congress, he was working in Switzerland. He heard third hand from a German businessman that the Nazis had a plan, that all of these reports of deportations, people being sent to Eastern Europe, all of these things were adding up to the fact that the Nazis were trying to murder the entire Jewish community of Europe, that they were rounding people up, sending them to the East in the millions and murdering them there. This seems really obvious to us now because we know the end of the story. We have seen images of liberation. We've learned about the Holocaust before. In 1942, it is trickier. There had been newspaper articles in 1940 and 41 talking about how communities in the Soviet Union, communities in Poland were being rounded up. But there weren't American reporters on the ground there reporting back. You know, the war had stopped the ability of Americans to actually see what was happening. And so for many Americans, they think this is just a war rumor. They think that there's no way that the Nazis are doing this. Why would they distract from their own war to try to murder innocent people? And Americans think that this is just a way to try to get us to fight. You know, you talk about the murder of women and children because you want to explain how evil the enemy is. And in reality, it can't possibly be that bad. So when Gerhard Rigner gets this information in Switzerland, he believes it. And he tries to send the information to the United States. The head of his organization was Rabbi Stephen Wise, who is the most famous rabbi in America, somebody who knew President Roosevelt. And Rigner figures, if I tell this information, if I can get it to Stephen Wise, he will meet with the president and together they will know what to do. Instead, the State Department, when they receive the message, instead of giving it to Stephen Wise, they decide to shelve it. They do not pass it along. And for the same reasons that I explained, one of them thought this is probably a war rumor. One of them said, I can't believe you would put this sort of information just in a telegram. And another said, even if this is true, there's nothing the United States can do about it. So it's not worth getting people riled up. The information gets out anyway, right? This is too big a secret to be kept for very long. And Stephen Wise gets the information via Great Britain, via a World Jewish Congress representative in Great Britain. And by the end of the year, by November, the State Department has confirmed to him that this is likely what is happening. Some State Department officials who were not involved in the decision to shelve the information talked to the Swiss and the Red Cross and the Vatican about what their people were seeing on the ground. And so they're able to report back by the end of November that, yes, this is likely what's happening. And so you see, Wise gets confirmation, 2 million Jews slain, Rabbi Wise asserts. There's still a little bit of doubt in there, right? Rabbi Wise says that 2 million Jews have been killed. Rabbi Wise says he learned through sources that things have been happening. So there is still a little bit of doubt even by November. But pretty soon after this information that the Nazis have a plan and are trying to murder the Jews of Europe has been largely confirmed and is treated as valid by the press. So after November 1942, this information is out there for the American people and is generally treated as true. November 1942, though, is also the same month that the Allies landed North Africa. Today is actually the anniversary of the 80-year anniversary, or 85th year anniversary. No, that's not right. I'm terrible at math. It's the 80th. It's the 80th anniversary of the landing in North Africa is today, actually, Operation Torch. And the landings are not going well. And so the minute that the Americans find out about the final solution, they are actually thousands of miles away from the killing centers where most people are being murdered. And the military, the American military, is all wound up in North Africa, not even on the European continent. And so the State Department and the Soviets and the British and a group of nations in exile all decide amongst themselves that there's nothing that they can do about it now other than win the war. And so they issue a statement, which you can see on the right. They condemn the Nazi policy that they say, the bestial policy of cold-blooded extermination is what they call it. And they say after the war, we're going to have war crimes trials. We are going to punish the perpetrators. So they do not promise any sort of rescue. They promise instead that we are going to punish the perpetrators after the war. And so for more than a year after this, for the entirety of 1943, more and more information is coming out about what the Nazis are doing. And there's more and more kind of growing pressure on the US government to do more, to not just focus on winning the war as soon as possible, but to also focus on what small pieces of rescue the United States could do. So there are, again, marches and rallies. There's a pageant called We Will Never Die that tours the country. This photo is an October 1943 rabbis march on Washington, Orthodox rabbis marching on Washington, meeting with the vice president, presenting a petition saying, we want the government to do something about this. At this point in the story, the Treasury Department gets involved. Very unlikely heroes. But at this point, then and now, the Treasury Department was responsible for US sanctions. And so they were responsible for making sure that money stays out of the hands of the Nazis. And this was the first war, World War II, in which the United States tried to have economic sanctions. And in the summer of 1943, the Treasury Department people who are in charge of upholding the sanctions, making sure the Nazis don't get any money, decide that they are going to start allowing small amounts of humanitarian aid through these blockades to try to get to Jewish communities in Europe that need them. Very small amount of money. And they argue that even if this money falls into the hands of the Nazis, ultimately it's not going to change the course of the war. We should try to do this tiny little bit to try to help people. Buy food, buy clothing, that sort of thing. And the State Department consistently said, no, this is not a good idea. We are not going to transmit that permission. We are not going to transmit that money. And this goes on for 5 months, where the Treasury Department keeps saying, we approve of this. And the State Department says, well, we don't. And so too bad. Sorry, I know this is your project, but we're definitely not going to help you with it. And so the Treasury Department gets incredibly frustrated. One of the best things about studying the Treasury Department is that at this time, the Treasury Secretary was a man named Henry Morgenthau Jr. He was not a money guy. He was not particularly good at economics, which you would expect from a Treasury Secretary, but he was a really good manager. And he really recognized talent and then trusted his staff. So he was a great boss, and he was a fantastic record keeper. So he, from the time he became Treasury Secretary in 1934 until 1945, so he's Treasury Secretary for more than 11 years, he kept pretty meticulous records down to recordings of many of his meetings. And so you can actually go online and you can see transcripts of a lot of the meetings that he held. It's a fantastic record of the Roosevelt administration. And so at one of these meetings in December 1945, Morgenthau's staff, who are incredibly fed up with the State Department, have this exchange. Josiah Du Bois, who is a lawyer at the Treasury Department, says, "Mr. Secretary, the only question we have in our mind, I think, is the bull has to be taken by the horns in dealing with this Jewish issue and get this thing out of the State Department into some agency's hands that's willing to deal with it frontally. For instance, take the complaint, what are we going to do with the Jews? We let them die because we don't know what to do with them." And then Randolph Paul, who was the Treasury Department's general counsel, says, "We are speaking as citizens now." And I always found that incredibly moving, this idea that they are not coming to their boss with a policy position or saying, this is really good politics, you should do this. They're coming because they're citizens of a democracy and they feel like their country is better than what the State Department is doing, that the United States can be a better place. Du Bois, actually the man who advocates for getting this thing out of the State Department, had actually just snuck into the State Department, into the file room on a Saturday morning, only a few days before this conversation. And he had discovered that the State Department's delays had been deliberate, that they had been deliberately keeping this humanitarian aid from Jewish communities, and that the undersecretary, one of the assistant secretaries of state, a man named Breckinridge Long, had specifically instructed US diplomats in Switzerland to stop sending messages about the Holocaust to the United States, specifically Gerhard Rigner's messages. Don't send them. All of the information that he is transmitting about the Holocaust is getting people upset. And so if the activists don't know what is happening in Europe, they won't put pressure on the government to do more. So that is fueling a lot of this anger. And armed with all of this evidence, everything that they had put together, the Treasury Department decides that they're going to go to the president. And in January 1944, they present Franklin Roosevelt with a version of this memo. This is an early draft, but it has the title, I don't know if you can read it, but it says, "Personal report to the president on the acquiescence of this government in the murder of the Jewish population of Europe." And it starts, "One of the greatest crimes in history, the slaughter of the Jewish people in Europe, is continuing unabated unless remedial," and then it continues, "unless remedial steps of a drastic nature are taken and taken immediately, I am certain that no effective action will be taken by this government to prevent the complete extermination of the Jews in German-controlled Europe, and that this government, the United States, will have to share for all time responsibility for this extermination." So they take this memo to Roosevelt, they explain to him what has been happening, and they bring along with them a copy of an executive order, asking Roosevelt to create a new government agency tasked with trying to rescue and provide relief for Jews and other persecuted minorities in Europe, that the United States should have a plan and should start to carry out rescue efforts. And Roosevelt agrees. January 22nd, 1944, he signs the executive order creating a war refugee board. That was the name of this new agency. It was largely staffed by people coming out of the Treasury Department, including the man who had been in charge of the US sanctions program, a man named John Paley, who you can see on the screen here. Paley was 34 at this point. He was born in South Dakota and raised in Omaha, so he did not have the pedigree that most of the State Department people had. He was a child of immigrants. He had been in charge of the US sanctions program and moves over to be in charge of US rescue efforts. The War Refugee Board is officially headed by the Secretaries of War, State, and Treasury, but like I said, it's almost entirely a Treasury Department operation. It is manned by Treasury. The offices are at Treasury. This is really a group of Treasury Department lawyers changing US policy. So from that moment on, from January 22nd, 1944 on, the US actually had a policy about the Holocaust, and it was a policy of rescue. And between the board's creation in January 1944 and when they shut down in September 1945, this group saved tens of thousands of lives. And so my book, Rescue Board, is really about how they did that, what information they knew and when, and how this policy of rescue really changed the way that the United States was operating. So there are spies, there are pirates, there's sneaking money in, and I'll explain some of that. There's basically everything that related to the Holocaust in 1944, 1945 crossed the desks of these people. Almost all of them were young. The oldest, I think, in the main staff was 38 years old. They were very idealistic and they worked incredibly hard. This was not a group that clocked in at 8 and out at 5. This was a group that spent, 17 months diligently every day trying to save people in Europe, a continent that most of them had never been to. John Paley had never been to Europe. And so the idea in the middle of a world war that you are now in charge of trying to rescue people tens of thousands of miles away on a continent that you've never seen in the midst of the fog of war had to be incredibly intimidating. These, the image you can see here are some of the big books on American response to the Holocaust. And you can see that they kind of have a narrative theme. And the theme tends to be one of anti-Semitism and indifference, that the United States didn't know anything or didn't do anything or was actively complicit in the murder of Jews. The War Refugee Board is often mentioned in some of these books, but it's usually towards the end of the book, obviously, chronologically, that makes sense, and is referred to kind of as the afterword, right? We didn't do anything, we didn't know anything. Oh, but there was this one thing, but it was too little and too late and it doesn't matter. And that was interesting to me when I started to look into this idea that the United States actually fundamentally did change its policy. How did that happen? How did we move from being an isolationist, racist, anti-Semitic country to being one that was actively trying to rescue people during a world war? How did that happen? And so I started to look into this. And one of the reasons that I think the War Refugee Board hadn't gotten a lot of attention before now, my book was the first book that was not self-published about the War Refugee Board, who they were and what they did and what they knew and the projects that they attempted. One of the reasons I think is the actual papers of the board. You need to look through all of the archival documents if you're going to write a book on this. And most of the records are at the FDR Library in Hyde Park, the Presidential Library. And there, it's about 120 boxes of records. And they're arranged in two groups, basically 60 boxes of correspondence and reports and 60 boxes of projects and documents. Correspondence and reports is alphabetical by the name of the person writing the letter or the organization that the person worked for. And the projects and documents are by topic. So you can probably see the problem, right? If you write a letter, I am me, Rebecca Erbelding. I work for the Holocaust Museum. So I could be under E for Erbelding, the first letter of my last name. I could be under U for United States Holocaust Memorial Museum, or I could be in the projects and documents file under whatever I'm writing about. If I'm writing about a presentation in Tallahassee, it could be under T for Tallahassee. It could be under P for presentations. You have no idea in this 120 boxes where anything is going to be. And it is organized the same way that it was organized in 1945. No one ever went back to try to fix it. And so the historians who had studied it before obviously did not have time or resources to go through all 120 boxes. And so they would try to find, the couple of folders that are titled the thing that they want to talk about. So you want to talk about Raoul Wallenberg, who the War Refugee Board hired. And I'll talk about him in a second. You're only going to go to the folders that are labeled by him or labeled with his name. But there could be tons of other stuff just kind of floating around in the boxes and you don't know. And so I knew from the beginning that I was going to have to look at everything, and I was going to have to figure out how to organize it all. So I started and spent about 2 years photographing the entirety of the collection, all 120 boxes. And I figured out that if I took all of those boxes and I, took photos with my camera, I would get all of these JPEGs, right? All of these images. And I could then print the images into PDFs. And so one image JPEG, if it's, a letter that's only one page, that becomes a 1-page PDF. But if it's a report, if it's a 20-page report, then I have a 20-page PDF, still one document, but now 20-page PDF. And so I gave each PDF a very specific title, and you can see an example here. So an example title would be 440621 WRB R08 F11 D179, which just seems like a random string of letters and numbers, but the first 6 digits are the date. So this was a letter that was created 1944, June the 21st. I found it in the War Refugee Board records, microfilm reel 8, folder 11, and it's the 179th image on that roll of microfilm. So I knew I can just look at it and I can see exactly where I found it, in what archive, and what the date was that it was created. I figured that if I did this for all 120 boxes and everything else that I found, and labeled it with this date, and then the archive, and then, all of the box folder or reel and folder, all of that information, and I put it all in one folder, all of these PDFs, and I ended up with about 40,000 PDFs. All these PDFs went into one folder and they sorted chronologically. And so no matter what archive I got the document from, no matter where it was in whatever box, here it was chronologically, in the order in which the War Refugee Board would have created it or received it or knew the information contained in it. And so I used a software entitled Papers, which I still use actually now for another book project that I'm working on. I can put all of the PDFs into this database, and then I can assign authors. I can I can take notes. I can see the document. I can assign keywords. Everything is searchable. And so as I'm reading through, I can say, well, this was written by this person. These are the things that that letter is about. These are quotes that I particularly like from it. And then I can search through. So I can say definitively, this is the first time this project is mentioned. This is the first time they learned this information, because I've read everything and I have this pretty elaborate database. So this is still the way I work. Getting back to the story of the War Refugee Board, what I found in those documents, the first thing that I discovered is that the very first thing that the War Refugee Board did, the day that FDR signed the executive order, the first thing they did was streamline humanitarian aid into Europe. This is probably the least sexy, but the most important thing that they did. By the end of the war, they had approved about $11 million in humanitarian aid, which is about $150 million today, to a whole host of different aid organizations. And the money was used to buy guns for the French underground. It was used to pay off border guards. It was used to provide food for children in hiding. It was used to create false papers. It was used to fund resistance movements. So this is incredibly important money. And the very first thing that the board did, this new organization, is they made it incredibly easy for organizations to send that humanitarian aid to places that needed it. From Washington, from the Treasury Department offices, which you can see here, John Paley is the man sitting on the right. Paley laid out his strategy for the board, and the strategy was really threefold. So the first thing that his organization was going to do is that they were going to try to convince the Nazis and their collaborators to stop the killing, get them to stop. The next thing that they were going to try to do is to move people who were in areas of safety, or areas where they could move into areas of safety. So France, Romania, kind of on the borders of Nazi territory, get them into areas that are safe. And the third, for people who are deep inside Nazi territory, they're going to try to keep them alive as long as possible. They're going to try to keep them alive long enough for the Allies to win the war and liberate the camps and liberate those areas. So I'll give you a quick example of each. One of the first things the War Refugee Board does is it starts a psychological warfare campaign. So it sends radio broadcasts into Nazi territory. They create leaflets that Allied airplanes drop onto German territory and Hungarian territory and Polish territory, warning people that the United States is watching, that we will have war crimes trials after the war, and now is not the time to become a perpetrator. In March 1944, they wrote a statement that Roosevelt released under his own name, again, warning the Germans, saying that the murder of the Jews of Europe is continuing, that the United States knows about this, that we will punish the perpetrators. The War Refugee Board, of course, wrote this statement, and only a week before Roosevelt issued it, the Nazis invaded Hungary. Hungary had been really the last country with a large Jewish community. There were about 800,000 Jews still alive in Hungary in 1944. And the War Refugee Board immediately added a paragraph specifically about Hungary, calling out the Hungarians and saying, now is not the time. Please do not do this. This did not work. We know that about 437,000 Hungarian Jews were deported to Auschwitz in the spring of 1944. But it is really difficult to tell, whether anyone was deterred from violence by these this protest movement and these these radio broadcasts and these leaflets. It's really difficult to say, this atrocity was averted because somebody got scared and decided not to carry it out, right? But what we do know is that people did find these reports. They heard the radio broadcast, they found the leaflets. I actually found this leaflet in an archive at the advice of a German man that I interviewed who had been a member of the Hitler Youth, had remembered finding this particular leaflet in a potato field in the spring of 1944. And he said that this is how he learned about the Holocaust, that Allied propaganda was really smart. On the other side of this statement, this warning from President Roosevelt against the German people, would be reports of local bombing raids. And so you on the ground would know, well, the Allies did hit this factory and they did hit this town. I'm on the ground, I can see that. And so you know that the stuff on one side of the leaflet is true. And so he said that this is how he found out that the Holocaust was happening, and it made sense to him and he believed it. The US government, through the War Refugee Board, also laundered money to sneak refugees into Sweden. This is Ivar Olsen. He was the Treasury Department's financial attaché to the Stockholm legation, which sounds like a very boring job, except that he was also an OSS spy. The OSS was the precursor to the CIA, and Ivar Olsen's code name was Crispin. And he was in charge of monitoring the movement of money and war material between Sweden and Nazi Germany. So when his War Refugee Board, his Treasury Department colleagues say, will you be our representative in Sweden? He says yes. They don't know about his spy job. And so he from that point on has 3 full-time jobs. He has a spy job, his cover job, and now his humanitarian aid job. Among other things, he is responsible for hiring Raoul Wallenberg, the now very famous Swedish rescuer who ends up going into Budapest and issuing protective papers, providing food and shelter to Hungarian Jews, saving thousands of lives, if not tens of thousands of lives. So Olsen is the one who hired him, who petitioned the Swedish government to send him, and was responsible for that. This is not how he laundered money, though. Olsen is laundering money to get these refugees into Sweden. And he decides that if he gets enough money from the US, he can get between 600 and 700 Latvian, Lithuanian, and Estonian refugees. He's going to buy boats and guns, and he's going to cross the North Sea with these boats and guns, pick up refugees on the beaches of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, and take them to islands off the coast of Sweden. So a very seemingly ridiculous plan that works. he does get the money, but the US has to be very careful about it. They do not want to be seen sneaking refugees into a friendly country. And Olsen even reports back that Swedish Jews, want to help as long as it doesn't involve bringing refugees into Sweden. So the US has to sneak this money in to get it to Olsen. And John Paley, the head of the War Refugee Board, decides, he had been in charge of keeping money out of the hands of the Nazis and stopping companies from trying to sneak money overseas. And so he decides he's going to use some of those tactics. So the War Refugee Board contacts the staff at Goodyear Tire in Akron, Ohio, and tells them, we are going to give you $50,000 to put on your books in Akron. In exchange, you are going to give Ivar Olsen $50,000 worth of Swedish kroner. And it works. Olsen is able to buy speedboats and guns. He gets about 4,000 people out of Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia onto the islands off the coast of Sweden. There's, some speedboats get caught by the Nazis, some speedboats get caught by the Swedes, some speedboats have to turn back. But he does manage to have a fairly successful rescue operation by sneaking this money into Sweden. Those records are not available in any of the 120 boxes that I first photographed. Somebody went through and removed them. And so before these records went to the archives, somebody scrubbed them from this story from those records. But as I said, Henry Morgenthau Jr., the Treasury Secretary, was an excellent record keeper and got copies of some of the cables that the War Refugee Board was sending. And they forgot to scrub his records too. So you can see this cable from June 1944, where Olsen wrote, this arrangement worked well, and although not foolproof, it's desirable from a security point of view. We do not recommend bank transfers because they unavoidably attract notice and suspicion. So the US successfully sneaks money into Sweden using a private company in order to bring refugees into a friendly country without that country knowing how. In Switzerland, the War Refugee Board needs somebody on the inside. Switzerland was entirely surrounded by enemy territory, and so they can't get a representative in. They need to find someone who's there. And Roswell McClelland, the man that I talked about at the beginning, who was inside an internment camp in southern France giving aid, had snuck across the the Swiss border with his wife in the fall of 1942, just as the Nazis were invading southern France. So they escaped into Switzerland, and the War Refugee Board decided to hire McClelland to be their aid worker. Because Switzerland had so many underground operations, so many people coming in and out of the country, which was the only neutral country in the middle of the continent, McClellan is doing all sorts of things, including starting ransom negotiations with the Nazis. The Nazis are looking around and seeing the same kind of landscape as everybody else. The Allies are likely to win the war. And so if the Americans care about the fate of Jews, maybe these Nazis can get something for them. And so they offer Jews for sale. The United States is never going to pay ransom. But Roswell McClellan, who's now 30 years old, and Sally Meyer, who was the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee's aid worker in Switzerland, they string along a group of high-ranking Nazis for about 7 months. At one point, McClelland even, puts on his suit, takes the train to Zurich, to the big banking center in the middle of Switzerland, and meets with SS Obersturmbannführer Kurt Becker, who reported directly to Heinrich Himmler, was dressed in an SS uniform, and McClellan claimed that he was President Roosevelt's personal emissary, representing the ransom deal, that the president was personally interested in the ransom deal and wanted to carry it out. And that move got about 1,600 people released from Bergen-Belsen, from the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp, as a good faith gesture on the part of the Nazis for the United States continuing these negotiations. The US never ended up paying any sort of ransom. but they are able to keep people alive with the idea that we will pay ransom, and so you better not do anything to harm them. Beyond all of that, and I'm wrapping up because I want to make sure that we have time for your questions. Beyond all of that, the War Refugee Board opens a refugee camp in upstate New York. They bring about 1,000 mostly Jewish refugees to live there, in part because the War Refugee Board was concerned that the United States was being hypocritical, that we were asking other countries to take refugees into their countries, but the United States was not taking any into ours. And so they open this refugee camp in upstate New York. They bring these people here and they keep them behind barbed wire in a small town in upstate New York until 1946. So more than 8 months after the end of World War II, the United States was still trying to decide what to do with these people, whether to let them in or whether to send them back to Europe. The War Refugee Board also created food packages, about 300,000 food packages that were distributed in the final weeks of the war to concentration camps, to Dachau, to Sachsenhausen, to Ravensbrück, to Buchenwald, and also delivered by the Red Cross to people on forced marches, people that they found on the side of the road. And so if you've ever heard a survivor give testimony where they talk about receiving a food package towards the end of the war, it was almost certainly packed on Long Island, shipped across the ocean to Sweden, disguised as a Red Cross package and distributed by the Red Cross, and paid for entirely by the US government. The War Refugee Board also distributed information to the American people about what was happening in Europe. So no longer was the State Department keeping information from the American people. The War Refugee Board was trying to get information about the Holocaust to the United States and to the American people. So in November 1944, they got a report that was written by 2 escapees from Auschwitz. It's very detailed, it's very graphic about what the process of arrival and selection and gassing was like at the camp. And the War Refugee Board, without asking anybody's permission in the US government, decides that they're going to release it to the press, that they are going to send it out to hundreds of newspapers nationwide and ask them to embargo it for Thanksgiving weekend. So Thanksgiving weekend, 1944, across the country, Americans woke up to read about Auschwitz. For most of them, it was the first time they had ever heard of that place. And for most, the first time they ever learned that the Nazis were gassing or were using Zyklon B gas to murder people. A few days after this report came out, the Washington Post issued an editorial entitled Genocide. The word genocide actually had not been a word prior to this war. It was coined in 1943 by a Polish Jewish refugee in the United States, a lawyer named Raphael Lemkin. And Lemkin said, you know, what the Nazis are doing, this is a new kind of crime. And the United States needs to learn this new word. And the Washington Post says the same thing. This is the first time that word is used in an American newspaper. It's used specifically in response to this report about Auschwitz. And the Washington Post editorial board says this is a new thing, and the United States, the Americans need to learn about what is happening. So in conclusion, I kind of feel like the War Refugee Board needs to re-enter our narrative about American response to the Holocaust. I think it's a really relevant history. This isn't just a history in which the United States was anti-Semitic and indifferent to what was happening. This is a story in which the United States changes over time, and it changes in part because of public pressure to do more, because of pressure within the government to do more, pressure in Congress to do more. And so I think that tells us that American policy can change, and it can change for the better. That's a message that I think we all need. And the fact that the War Refugee Board was debating a lot of things that Americans continue to debate today. So they were talking about, you know, do we participate in ransom negotiations to try to save lives? Do we prioritize rescue, trying to get people out of a situation? Or do we provide relief, aid for them while they're there? How do we bring refugees to the United States when there are very real national security concerns? All of those things were things that the War Refugee Board was debating. And when we forget about them, when we don't put them into our story, we can't then learn from the decisions that they were making and the things that they were attempting. And so one of the things that's been gratifying about this book is how much it's been read by the State Department and by the Treasury Department. At this point, I think I've spoken at the Treasury Department 5 times, including to some all-staff meetings about the history of this organization. And I was at the State Department a week and a half ago. They really are listening to this history and trying to learn from it. And I find that really gratifying. And the fact that, 4 years after this book came out, I'm still talking to groups like you and sharing the story of the War Refugee Board. So I think it's okay to move to questions now. And I just want to add, if anybody does decide to pick up a copy of the book and wants a signed copy or something signed, I'm more than happy to do that. You can look me up online. I'm the only person with my name, so you will find my website very easily. And if you just send me a quick message with your address, I'll happily send you a signed book plate. I know book talks tend to have like the book purchasing part at the end. And since I can't sign stuff for you there, I'm more than happy to send you a letter. I'm going to stop sharing now so that you can see me again. Hi.
Thank you so much, Rebecca. We'll just give a round of applause in the room. That was excellent. Very impressive research and organization and history keeping there. So thank you so much for sharing that. I'm going to go ahead and I'll allow Barbara to come over here, and we will open up the floor for questions. You want me to, I can kind of moderate. Yeah, I can moderate this.
Questions.
Okay, sure. Yeah. Well,
then I'll conclude. How's that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, we'll open up the floor to questions. I believe, was there one that, oh, okay. I see we had a class that attended in the Q&A. Okay, perfect. Yeah, so we'll open up the floor to questions. I don't see any in the chat yet, but if there are any questions, you can either put it in the Q&A chat or folks can raise their hands.
And I'll ask her questions.
And Barbara will come over. Yeah.
Okay, so to take you to do the 120 boxes, that to me is an amazing story.
It took, well, I mean, the photographing took probably 10 months,
Wow.
slowly over 10 months. But then I had to go through and actually print the PDFs and do the coding and everything. So all in, it took about 2 years. And that was the tricky part, was telling my professors that I was not going to write anything for them for 2 years, that they were just going to have to trust me, that it was going to be worth it in the end. And thankfully, they were allowing me to continue to pay tuition. They didn't have to review any papers until my dissertation came. But when my dissertation came, it was 800 pages long. So I don't think they were ready for that one. But
that must have been like a lot of information now to find that you didn't have before, right?
Yeah, I mean, that was kind of my argument, was I'm going to write everything in my dissertation because nobody's done this work before. And so if I can lay kind of breadcrumbs for future historians, I'm going to do that. And then when I got to the actual book, when I was publishing the book, it was for a different audience. It was for a non-academic audience. I wanted my dad to be interested in it. And so I kind of took the dissertation, the very long thing, cut out all the boring bits, and then said, this is the story here. This is the story of these people. And so the book is actually quite different from the dissertation. And so now that I'm working on a second book, I'm trying to figure out how do I start with the story when I am trained to, explain everything that happens. So it's an adjustment for me.
You do have like a second part now after the book, actually.
Yeah. I mean, for a while, the second part was working on the Ken Burns film. And
well,
so
okay, that's true. We didn't talk about that amazing experience, right?
Yeah, that was something I worked on with them for about 3 years. And so now that the film is out in the world, I need a project. And so now I'm towards the tail end of getting ready to start really in earnest on the second book. And
so there is a question in there, but I want forget if you can talk about the film for a minute and just say how important this film is, number one, and number two, if how did they contact you did you actually get a phone call from Ken Burns?
I have been to Ken's house. So I have talked to Ken many times. He's great. Very, very smart, loves this country so much, and knows so much about it. It was amazing to work with them. So they had found my book, and they had also found the Holocaust Museum's exhibit on Americans in the Holocaust. In fact, some of my colleagues at the museum pitched the exhibit to them and said, we are working on this exhibit. It seems like it would be really ripe for a film. Are you interested? And the filmmakers said yes. And so they knew me a bit through the book, didn't quite make the connection, I think, that I also worked at the museum and that I had been working on this exhibit. And so I was actually one of the first interviews that they did. My interview for the film was done in October 2018, so 4 years ago now. And then I just kind of became part of the team who reviewed the scripts as they were putting the scripts together and said, oh, you need more on this. This quote isn't quite right. Why don't you look at these sources? And I kind of stuck around, like I turned out to be okay at it, I think, and give them decent feedback and suggestions and stuff. And so that is why when you look at the credits, my name is above the other historians. And
excellent. It's an excellent, anybody that has
be
not
thrilled on that for the rest of my life.
That's
I
to
will
see the
never
film.
believe that happened.
Yes, everybody look up US and the Holocaust
Yeah.
film.
Oh, it's
and
a great film. And it's not just about American response, but it really is the story of the Holocaust and the story of World War II and how all three work together. How the
Right.
Holocaust
But he
impacted the
talks
war,
so
the
much
war-
about Anne Frank and about anti-Semitism, about the whole picture.
Right. And even so the film itself is available at most local libraries. You can find it online if you're a PBS supporter. But even if you can't find it somehow, on PBS Learning Media, which is the educator version of PBS, there are 8 different lesson plans related to the film, and each one of them has film clips. So clips that range between 2 and 10 minutes long. You can actually see the majority of the film, but also it's great for teachers. If there are any teachers or aspiring teachers out there, this is the place to go to see lesson plans that incorporate these clips or to pull the clips for your own classroom.
It's done very, very well for everybody, education-wise. So we do have some questions now I'm going to read.
Yes, actually, they asked to be unmuted to ask their questions. So
Okay,
yeah,
they're
so
going
Summer
to
will unmute.
Go ahead.
Dr.
Excellent.
Pendleton. Yes. Okay, yeah. Did you unmute her? Yeah. Okay, yeah. So Dr. Pendleton, you can go ahead and ask your question.
Okay, thank you so much. I do want to say that I really enjoyed this presentation, like very fascinating information. So as I was hearing you talk, I heard you talking about just the skepticism among the American people, where people didn't really seem to know what to believe. And it somewhat reminds me of the times we're in now. So I wanted to ask you, based on your knowledge of the history of like the skepticism that people had about the Holocaust, would you say that that is reminiscent of what we're seeing in recent times in regards to people, kind of distrusting the news that they're seeing about current events? Thank you.
Yeah, I think there's some similarities and there's some differences. So misinformation obviously is a huge similarity. There were certainly people who were planting misinformation in American newspapers. Nazi sympathizers were saying, oh, it's not that bad what's happening in Germany. I'm on the streets. I'm seeing it. Nothing to worry about. Don't concern yourselves. So there is an active disinformation and misinformation campaign in the 1930s and 40s. But there's also, I think, when you get to the war, a lack of information. And that, I think, is a little bit different than today. Today, we have mountains of information. We have so much information. You can go online and see drone footage of Ukraine in real time. That did not happen in the 1930s and 40s, obviously. And so Americans are hearing only rumors. Today, we are bombarded by so much that it's really hard to separate the noise and find what is really important. So I think that is maybe, I would say, the difference. So there is a crisis of information, but the crisis is coming in a different direction.
All right. And thank you so much. We're going to open it up for Professor Phipps to ask her question next.
I wanted to just be asked, but I was wondering how the people of upstate New York, did they help with the refugees? Were they involved at all? I mean, this was local, it was right there. Were they able to help? I think helping locally is gonna be important in the future. So
Yeah. I'm thrilled to report that they did. I say that as someone who is from upstate New York, and this was a story I did not know really growing up, but this was a town that was working class. It's Oswego, so it's right, if this is New York State, right, this is Buffalo, this is the Catskills, Oswego's right here, right? It's right on the corner of the lake and right on the lake. But it's a working class town. And it was a town with a lot of first and second generation immigrants. And so when the refugees arrive, for a lot of people, it was the most fascinating thing that had happened there in a long time. And so they immediately start crowding the fence and trying to talk to people. Teenagers who spoke Italian at home go and start talking to refugees who had made it to Italy and had learned a little bit of Italian. And so by the end of the first week, there's reports that kids are passing their bicycles over so the refugee kids can ride around. It's actually a wonderful story. This is the book that I'm working on now, is the story of the town and the government and the people who ended up at this camp.
How wonderful.
And so it is a fantastic story, and look for it in like 3 years when I finally like get around to this being my project. But the people of the town are incredibly warm to them. The teachers start coming in on Saturdays to try to learn how to teach kids who have English as a second language. Like it's a really wonderful story. And a lot of these teachers end up testifying to Congress when Congress comes about how amazing these refugee kids are and how much they deserve to stay in the US. And so it's a great story, and thank goodness they ended up in that town.
Thank you so much. It looks like we have another question in the chat from Susan. Susan, would you like to be unmuted? Does she want to be unmuted? Or... Okay, got it. Well, we have it in the chat. Yeah.
Okay, and right before that though, I think Maureen raised her hand. I think.
Oh, sure. Maureen, did you have a question that you wanted to ask right now?
I may have misunderstood that though. I wasn't sure she raised her hand in the.
Okay.
I mean,
Got it. Well, I see Susan is, she said she would like to be unmuted. So we'll go ahead and have Susan. Okay, Maureen said no. Okay, thank you. Yeah.
Okay.
All right, Susan, you're ready. Is she unmuted? Susan, feel free to ask your question. I think you're unmuted now.
Okay. Why do you think that there's so many people still in the world who do not believe any of these atrocities have happened, especially with all the documentation that's out there now?
So the question, in case you couldn't hear it, was why do so many people still believe that these atrocities, I assume you mean the Holocaust, didn't happen? Anti-Semitism. This is one that has a very simple answer. There is overwhelming evidence that this happened. The Holocaust is the most well-documented crime in the world. And all of the evidence lines up, and so you have to willfully want it not to be true, and that goes to anti-Semitism. But even if you listen to and read anti-Semitic language, and I don't advise you doing that, you will see that even anti-Semites sometimes believe that it happened when it's beneficial to them. And so they will say the Nazis didn't murder anybody, or the Nazis didn't kill them in this way, or they minimize the Holocaust or distort the Holocaust. And they also then attack Jews using discussion of ovens and discussion of all of this stuff, or like 6 million was not enough. And if you say 6 million was not enough, then you're admitting that there were 6 million. And so the only answer is anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Rebecca. All right, so are there any last questions? Yeah, we have one in the room. Yes.
The database that you created, are you going to share that with anyone?
So I don't know if you heard the question.
I
you
did,
hear-
yeah.
Okay, great.
The
Yeah.
question was, do I share the database with anybody? So because I purchased a subscription to the software, I can't share the actual database with my notes, but I did share all of the scans that I had done with the FDR library. And so if you go onto the FDR library website, they have the fully digitized War Refugee Board collection now. And if you scroll through it, sometimes you will see a hand creep into the frame of the photo or some keys off to the side. And that is my hand and those are my keys. Because when I finished, I wanted people to be able to check me, right? I want you to be able to read the book and say, oh, she got this in box 5, folder 7. I'm interested in that. Let me find box 5, folder 7. And so you can go and check me, make sure I'm right. And also use that for your own projects. So that stuff is available. And I'm also happy to do searches for people. That has come up a number of times where, I mention one person in a book and somebody says, oh, that was my great uncle. What else do you have? Did you find anything else? And it's very easy for me to just do a quick search and then I can export the PDFs out to them of everything that is related to their family member or whatever topic they're interested in. So I'm always happy to do those searches, but the full War Refugee Board records are online now.
Right. Yep, we have one more question. I think this might be
Rebecca,
our
do you
last.
have, anybody have the records or list of all the refugees that came to Camp Oswego?
Oh yeah, of course. Yes.
Those would be, those are
They're
really
probably
interesting.
online somewhere.
Okay.
But I have them in multiple versions and people were born and they died and it ended up being a little more than 1,000 all told of people who lived there. I don't know if you can see over here, like right by the birdcage, I have stacks of index cards. Right,
Okay.
kind of here where my finger is. Those are the index cards that I made of all of the families because I wanted to make sure that I knew all of their names. And it has worked out, I can usually tell you a little bit about each family, which has been a project, but I think a really important one.
I know you didn't mention, but I always love the story of Ruth Gruber.
Ruth Gruber was young. She was a Department of the Interior staff member at this time. She ended up being an author and a photojournalist and an advocate for refugees throughout her life, and she died at age 106. She accompanied the refugees from Italy to the United States and ended up staying involved with them. She was originally just going on the ship to try to collect, some of their experiences and some of their stories so that when the ship arrived in New York, she could talk to the press and say, this is why the US government is taking these people, look what they've been through. But on the way, the way that I think it's hard not to love people when you learn more about them. She had fallen in love with them and they had fallen in love with her. And so she ended up staying involved with the camp the entire time that it existed. So she will definitely end up being a character in the book.
Well, thank you so much, Rebecca. I want to be respectful of everyone's time. If anyone has any follow-up questions, would you mind, Rebecca, maybe leaving your contact information maybe in the chat if anyone has any follow-up? I think she can.
Chat is disabled.
Oh, for
yeah,
her
It's disabled.
Okay, well,
Barbara has it, but it's my first initial and last name at ushmm.org.
Okay.
I can give it to them.
Okay, thank you. That's
Thank
easier.
you. Yes, thank you. And so we just had a couple closing remarks. We do have an event. I guess I'll turn the camera so folks can see me too. We have an event tomorrow for those who can come out to continue Holocaust Education Week. It'll be an HSS 121. I believe it's from 11 a.m. to 12:15 p.m. with our own Dr. Monty Finkelstein, and he'll be talking about Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass. There will be snacks provided there, so we encourage everyone to attend. Also, we wanted to present a certificate of appreciation to you, and you can stay with me, Barbara, if you'd like to be in the view here. So let's see if we can share our screen with you to do so. Okay, yeah, let me open up the right screen here. All right, and then just bear with me as I actually pull it up. I think I gotta pull up their certificate. Okay. All right, so here we are. So we just wanted to present our certificate of appreciation to Dr. Rebecca Erbelding. Oh, is it not screen sharing?
Yes, it is, isn't it?
Oh, okay, hang on, let me
Wait.
stop. Let me stop my share. You guys are seeing my
It's working,
USB
it's
thumb
just a
drive,
double
huh?
click instead of
Okay.
a single.
Let me
click.
share my actual screen and then, can you see it now?
Yeah.
Okay, good.
good.
Okay, yeah, it's technical fun. I'm glad
Okay.
Summer's here to help us. So anyways, we want to present our certificate of appreciation to Dr. Rebecca Erbelding for her contribution and support of our 3rd annual Holocaust Education Week on the behalf of myself, the interim director of library services, and then Barbara Goldstein, the executive director of HERC. We wanted to present you the certificate on this 8th day of November, 2022. So thank you so much.
Thank you. And we're going to look for your next book.
And we have a
Thank
print
you.
copy, by the way, that we will mail you. So Barbara will get your address to send you.
Perfect.
the print
Awesome. Thank you
copy.
so much.
Oh, anytime.
And
We're
also,
so
can I add
thankful
one
for
more
you.
thing? Rebecca, you mentioned the books now. We have a local bookstore in town, Midtown Reader. If you get the books, Rebecca can send us the autographed book plates, right?
Yep.
Okay,
Absolutely.
Awesome.
thank you.
And one last thing, we do have a survey. So I will put the survey link in the chat for our virtual participants. If you could please complete that. If there's instructors with students in your class, if you could have your students complete the survey independently so we could get all of their feedback, that would be wonderful. Our face-to-face attendees, you have the survey at your desk, at your seat, so feel free to answer it. We have pens up front. We welcome your feedback. So thank you so much. And I believe that wraps up all of our announcements. The only other thing I'll mention, of course, we have, if any extra credit attendees, please make sure for students, make sure you complete the survey. That's how we'll get your name and know you're here for extra credit. And then for face-to-face, that's why we had our clipboard. So thank you guys so much. There are refreshments for those in LB 151. And thank you so much to Dr. Erbelding. Fantastic, very detailed, very inspiring research. I am not quite a historian yet, but I feel like I've learned a lot from you and how to go through that process of recording history. And so it's truly amazing to hear your work. Any other
Yeah,
closing
thank you
remarks?
so
Okay.
much.
Yes, thank you so
Thanks.
much.
Okay, take care.
And thank you guys. Yes, have a wonderful rest of your day.